Word spread quietly through the wet English countryside in the spring of 1944. Regular people in town saw many trucks driving by at night, bridges shaking from the weight of heavy vehicles, and large airfields suddenly full of bombers and gliders. To someone just watching, Britain seemed to turn into one huge army base. For the Germans looking across the English Channel, secret reports suggested some activity, but didn't show how big it really was. The trick was planned, carefully done by the Allies, and almost no one in Berlin understood what was about to happen. The German High Command thought any attack on Western Europe would be small. Their idea was based on how hard it is to move supplies. They were sure that no army ever could land more than a few groups of soldiers at once. Traditionally, landing on beaches had been small, risky events. Even the DEP raid in 1942, which had a few thousand soldiers, ended badly for the attackers. The Germans learned the wrong thing from that, thinking that bigger plans would be impossible. This belief became a firm idea, keeping them from seeing that America, with its huge industry, could try something bigger than anyone had imagined. At the same time, American planners in London and Washington were changing the rules of war. They gathered not just groups of soldiers, but a whole army from across the ocean, helped by floating harbors, pipes laid across the sea, and many transport ships bigger than anything Europe had seen. By the start of June, the Allies had secretly gathered thousands of boats for landing in southern England. These boats, able to drive tanks and trucks right onto beaches, were key to the plan. To hide the buildup, fake camps, dummy tanks, and fake radio messages were made in Kent and Sussex to make it seem like the attack would be at Killala. German intelligence believed the trick. In Berlin, officers looked at aerial photos of defenses on the coast. The so-called Atlantic Wall went for more than 2,000 kilometers with bunkers, mines, and big guns. To Hitler and many of his generals, the wall seemed impossible to break through. They didn't think they needed to prepare for an enemy who could smash through it with huge power. Rommel, more careful, thought that the Allies were getting stronger way beyond what the Germans thought. But even he couldn't imagine 150,000 men landing in one day. That number sounded more like a dream than a real plan. Every night, German spy pilots reported only small things: trucks moving through the countryside, quick looks at ships in the harbor, and strange camouflage patterns. They saw rubber tanks and wooden planes spread across fields, but didn't know they were fakes. The intelligence officers in Paris wrote reports saying Allied groups of soldiers were spread out thinly. These reports went to the Führer, making him even more sure that the Reich could fight off any attack. But on the ground in Britain, American soldiers trained hard. Soldiers practiced in fake towns built to look like French towns. Engineers practiced making holes in barbed wire and minefields. Tank crews drove their Shermans onto beaches during exercises called Amphibious and Tiger, fixing the mistakes from earlier beach landings. The skies above were always noisy as bombers hit railway lines in France to cut off the area of battle. All of this happened openly but hidden by lies and tricks. In the spring nights, lights flickered in the barns of southern England as generals looked closely at maps. They were planning a big attack that would change war. The whisper got louder, echoing across rivers and airfields until by June, the Allied invasion force was over 2 million men waiting to cross. But the Germans, fooled by too much confidence and tricks, still thought in terms of tens of thousands, never hundreds of thousands. The scene was set for the biggest surprise of the century. The German idea of security depended a lot on the Atlantic Wall, that long line of defenses stretching from Norway down to the Spanish border. In movies made for show, the wall was shown as a fortress without any weak spots, a concrete shield that no army could ever break through. Along the beaches of Normandy, pillboxes were put into dunes. Big guns were covered in steel and strong concrete, and thousands of obstacles, spiked rails, wooden stakes with mines, and huge steel barriers were put into the sand to tear apart landing boats before they got to shore. From Berlin's view, this was a line that couldn't be broken. The main person behind this idea was Adolf Hitler himself. He had demanded that the coastline be made unbeatable, and the Reich spent huge amounts of work and supplies on concrete bunkers instead of soldiers that could move around. When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel took over command in France in late 1943, He was surprised by how spread out the German groups of soldiers were. Many were made up of older soldiers and new people with no experience. The real fighting power of the Wehrmacht had been used up on the Eastern Front. To make up for this weakness, Rommel focused more on making the defenses on the beaches stronger. He said that the attack had to be stopped at the water's edge, because if the Allies got ashore with their huge numbers, the battle would be lost. But even Rommel, as careful as he was, didn't realize how big the Allies' plan was. His engineers worked hard to plant millions of mines, but they didn't have enough supplies to cover every spot. German intelligence reports showed only parts of what the Allies could do, and many of those guesses were old. When Rommel traveled along the coast in early 1944, he often said that the Allies would probably attack the Podakala, the shortest way across the Channel. After all, that was where V-1 rocket launch sites threatened England, and where the German High Command thought the most important strategic spot was. Normandy seemed less likely to them, too far from German industrial areas and without big ports. The false sense of security was made worse by Hitler's desire to spread out power. Decisions about moving soldiers needed his direct approval. Armored groups of soldiers placed inland were under his control, meaning local commanders couldn't act quickly if the Allies suddenly landed. This problem would be terrible when the attack finally came. By the spring of 1944, German officers looked at their coastal guns with pride, pointing to the huge guns at Point du Hoc or the big fortresses near Cherbourg. They held practice drills with live fire, sure that no invasion fleet could survive under such firepower. They remembered the lessons of Gallipoli in the First World War, where landing forces had been destroyed by defenders in strong positions. For them, the math seemed simple. A few thousand attackers might try a raid, but they would fail against the wall. What they never thought about was that America had changed the rules. While German factories struggled to replace lost tanks and planes, American shipyards were making landing boats, Liberty ships, and tank carriers by the hundreds every month. The Allies were not planning a raid. They were planning to move a whole army at once, helped by a supply system so big that the Atlantic Wall would not matter once the beaches were safe. But to the men in gray uniforms watching the bunkers, this possibility was impossible to imagine. The wall stood tall, concrete shining in the coastal sun. And with every day that passed, German confidence grew stronger, even as the storm gathered secretly. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the Channel itself seemed to turn into a floating city of war. For those who saw it, the sight was unbelievable. Almost 7,000 vessels stretched across the horizon from tall battleships to tiny landing boats bobbing in the waves. It was the biggest fleet ever put together in human history. The Germans, looking at the water through periscopes and coastal watchposts, had no way to understand what they were seeing. They had expected dozens of ships, maybe a few hundred at most. Instead, an ocean of steel and firepower moved towards the French coast. Every ship in that fleet had a job. Heavy cruisers and battleships had huge naval guns able to throw shells the size of cars into bunkers miles inland. Destroyers stayed closer to shore, ready to hit German positions with fast fire. Hundreds of transports carried soldiers packed tightly below decks, their gear stacked and labeled, waiting for the signal to get off. Behind them came wave after wave of landing boats, each designed to lower its steel ramp and let soldiers into the surf. Even farther back, huge cargo ships waited with tanks, trucks, and bulldozers, the main part of the invasion's supplies. The Allies even brought parts for making harbors, called mulberries, designed to be put together into working ports within days. Such engineering achievements were impossible for the German command to imagine. Above the fleet, the sky roared with Allied air power. Almost 12,000 aircraft helped the invasion. Fighters flew overhead to make sure they controlled the air, while bombers had already hit railway yards and bridges to stop German reinforcements from arriving quickly. Planes carrying soldiers released paratroopers into the dark hours before dawn, and gliders quietly landed men behind enemy lines. The complete coordination between sea and sky was something the Wehrmacht had never faced before. From the view of German coastal defenders, the sight was overwhelming. Reports rushed up the chain of command, filled with surprised descriptions of endless lines of ships. Batteries opened fire, but their shells landed among only a few of the enemy vessels. For every Allied ship damaged, dozens more moved forward. Some German officers thought, even in those first hours, that this must be a trick. Their minds couldn't accept that the Allies had put so many resources into Normandy instead of Kalala. The truth was that years of American industrial production had made this moment possible. Shipyards in New York, Baltimore, and San Francisco had made transports and landing boats faster than German intelligence could even count them. Oil refineries supplied fuel in amounts measured not by barrels, but by oceans. On the beaches of southern England, soldiers had been trained to be efficient, practicing over and over until every move became automatic. The invasion force showed not only military strength, but also a whole economy ready for war, something the Reich couldn't match. When the naval guns began to thunder, whole German defenses shook. Shells destroyed watchposts, broke barbed wire, and buried minefields under collapsing dunes. The amount of firepower was bigger than anything the Wehrmacht had used in France. For the Germans, who had always been proud of their discipline and tactical skill, this was a nightmare beyond their plans. They had planned for small raids. Instead, they faced an industrial monster, a storm of steel and fire designed to sweep them aside. The first hours of June the 6th didn't start with the roar of naval guns, but with silence broken by the steady sound of aircraft engines over the channel. While German guards watched the sea, the Allies had already started their invasion from the air. Shortly after midnight, more than 20,000 American and British paratroopers jumped into the darkness. Their job was to take bridges, cut communications, and start chaos behind German lines before the beach landings began. This was not a raid. It was the start of a planned storm, and its size surprised the defenders completely. For the men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, the night was hard. Clouds, flak, and bad navigation spread them across the countryside. Some dropped into flooded fields, made on purpose by the Germans, drowning under heavy gear. Others landed far from where they were supposed to, forming small groups of soldiers who made up attacks against outposts and crossroads. But this chaos became a weapon. German commanders struggled to understand reports of battles happening in many places at once. Communications lines were cut, bridges were taken or blown up, and trucks found themselves attacked on roads they thought were safe. At the same time, British paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division glided quietly towards the eastern side of the invasion area. Their most famous achievement was at Pegasus Bridge, where glider troops attacked a key crossing over the Caen Canal in the first minutes of D-Day. By keeping that bridge safe, they stopped German counterattacks from splitting the invasion front. Such actions surprised the German defenders, who had never seen airborne forces used in such big numbers and with such daring skill. Gliders, weak wooden aircraft pulled behind bombers, carried jeeps, big guns, and even small tanks. They landed in fields and meadows, spreading equipment and men in the dark. Though losses were heavy, the number of airborne troops overwhelmed local troops. Farmers in Normandy woke up to find their orchards full of American paratroopers, their barns taken over by soldiers setting up radio posts. Resistance fighters quickly joined up with them, guiding the lost men and giving information on German positions. For the Wehrmacht, the confusion was crippling. Messages poured into regional headquarters describing enemy forces everywhere north of Carentan, east of Caen, near Es Marielles. German officers couldn't tell the difference between main attacks and small groups of survivors. Many thought these parachute drops were tricks to take attention away from Calais, still believing that the real invasion would come elsewhere. Hours were lost as commanders argued, waiting for permission from higher command to move armored soldiers. Meanwhile, the disruption was already working. German big guns got no new bullets because their supply trucks had been attacked. Reinforcement trucks ran into roadblocks manned by paratroopers with bazookas and grenades. Telephone lines lay in piles across muddy fields, cut by airborne engineers who had landed just hours before. The defenders along the coast, expecting to talk with nearby units instead, found themselves alone and blind. The night of gliders and parachutes showed the Allies' control of coordination. Never before had so many airborne troops been used in a single operation. It showed not only bravery, but also the skill of moving thousands of men with their weapons and vehicles into enemy territory in one night. For the Germans, This was the first clear sign that the invasion happening before them was unlike anything in history. By dawn, the beaches had yet to be attacked, but the battlefield of Normandy was already being changed in the darkness above and behind the Atlantic Wall. By the time the first light of June 6th broke over the Channel, the defenders of Normandy were already struggling from confusion from the airborne attack, but nothing prepared them for the moment when the landing boat doors slammed open and tens of thousands of men charged through the surf. At 5 beaches stretching across 50 miles of coastline, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, the Allied soldiers began their attack. Among these, Omaha became the most famous. There, American troops of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions faced cliffs full of German machine guns and big guns. The Germans had made Omaha strong with interlocking fields of fire. Mortar pits and bunkers had perfect views of the sand, while mines and barbed wire blocked the exits. When the ramps of the first Higgins boats dropped, soldiers jumped into chest-deep water, many weighed down by packs and weapons. Machine gun bullets stirred the surf. Some men drowned before reaching shore, while others crawled forward, holding close to the sand as shells exploded around them. But the Americans kept going without stopping. Small groups crawled to the sea wall, engineers making holes through obstacles under constant fire. What surprised the Germans was not only the bravery of people, but the huge number of attackers that kept coming, wave after wave, no matter the losses. At Utah Beach, a mistake in direction caused the 4th Infantry Division to land almost a mile away from where they were supposed to. Oddly, this error saved them from stronger enemy attacks. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., the former president's oldest son, personally guided his soldiers onto the beach, famously saying, "We will begin the war from right here." In a few hours, Utah was safe, with paratroopers joining up inland to make the beach area bigger. The British and Canadians had their own hard times at Gold, Juneau, and Sword. At Juneau, Canadian soldiers had to fight through water up to their chests and concrete walls, suffering many losses in the first groups. But by noon, they had gone further inland than any other Allied group, taking over towns and destroying German strongholds. The British at Golden Sword fought through heavily defended towns, using special armored vehicles called Hobart's Funnies to remove mines, break down bunkers, and set up temporary bridges. For German soldiers defending, the scene was too much to handle. Even though they caused many casualties, more and more Allied soldiers kept coming. Naval ships firing their guns silenced some strong points, while destroyers sailed very close to the beaches to shoot directly at German positions. Communications stopped working as radios broke or were destroyed, leaving groups of soldiers fighting until the end, without knowing what was happening in the bigger battle. The mental impact was huge. German soldiers who thought they would only face a few groups of soldiers now watched a never-ending stream of landing boats, carrying men and vehicles, which made them lose hope. By noon, tanks moved across the sand, crushing things in their way and providing protection. Big guns, mortars, and machine guns that had once controlled the beach were slowly drowned out by the Allies' stronger firepower and more soldiers. The Germans realized they were not just facing a small attack, but a huge wave. In the towns behind the beaches, French people came out carefully, watching the flow of men in strange uniforms move inland. For them, being freed had begun. For the soldiers defending for Germany, the idea of the Atlantic Wall was falling apart quickly. What they faced on June 6th was not a normal attack, but the biggest water invasion in history, driven by the American and Allied desire to break through Fortress Europe in one big strike. As the morning turned into the afternoon on June 6th, the battle changed from desperate fighting on the beach to something even more amazing. There was a seemingly endless flow of men and equipment coming from the sea. German soldiers who thought the first groups of soldiers were the main Allied force soon realized with horror that those bloody hours were just the start. Behind the soldiers came the machinery of modern war, on a scale that no European country had ever seen. On the beaches of Normandy, bulldozers came off the landing boats almost as quickly as tanks and jeeps. American engineers started clearing away wreckage, setting up temporary roads made of steel mesh and marking safe paths through minefields. In just a few hours, temporary supply areas grew right on the beach. There were piles of ammunition, boxes of food, and rows of fuel containers waiting to be moved inland. Naval beach officers directed traffic with flags and whistles, turning chaos into a well-organized system. For every soldier rushing the dunes, there were many more ready to follow with supplies, medical help, and reinforcements. The amount of supplies was hard to understand. By the end of that first day, over 150,000 Allied soldiers had landed, supported by more than 20,000 vehicles. American Sherman tanks rumbled across raised roads while trucks carried big guns inland. Field hospitals were set up in tents behind the beaches where surgeons worked without stopping to save the wounded. Military police organized prisoners of war, escorting shocked German captives back toward the shore to be shipped to Britain. One of the Allies' most clever achievements was quickly setting up ready-made harbors. These mulberry structures, huge concrete blocks, and floating roadways were towed across the channel and put together just off the coast. In a few days, they provided docking space for cargo ships, allowing the Allies to unload supplies at a rate similar to major ports. German commanders had never expected such engineering feats. They had counted on the lack of harbors to starve any invading force. Instead, the Americans brought their own ports with them. Fuel was another very important thing. The Allies had planned Operation Pluto, a pipeline under the ocean, which would eventually pump fuel directly from Britain to France through underwater pipelines. While it was not fully working on D-Day itself, the very planning of such a project showed how well the Allies had prepared. German officers who were used to saving fuel for their armored groups could hardly imagine an enemy able to lay pipelines under the sea to support an army with vehicles. As the reinforcements poured ashore, German attempts to fight back weakened. The 21st Panzer Division managed to push toward the coast near Sword Beach, but it did not have enough strength and coordination. By the time their tanks got close to the shoreline, Allied planes swooped down in huge numbers, scattering them with bombs and rockets. The defenders found that any movement during the day led to destruction from the sky, making organized counterattacks almost impossible. The huge wave of soldiers and equipment showed not just military power, but the sheer strength of American industry. German soldiers on the ground could see it for themselves. There were endless lines of trucks moving inland, big guns being set up before their positions were even silenced, and replacements arriving faster than defenders could shoot. What started as a fight for beaches quickly became a display of unstoppable force. The German soldiers had started the day believing in the Atlantic Wall. By the end of the day, they were facing a reality that no wall could stop, a modern invasion force powered by supplies that were much bigger than their ability to resist. News of the invasion did not reach Berlin in one clear message, but in pieces that added up with growing fear. Messages from Normandy spoke of paratroopers scattered across the countryside, of naval guns destroying defenses, and of beach defenses giving way under constant pressure. At first, Hitler's close advisors were suspicious of these reports. For months, they had been sure the Allies would attack at Calais, where the channel was narrowest and weapon sites threatened London. To many in the German government, Normandy still seemed like a trick. But as the hours passed, the size of the truth could no longer be denied. By noon on June 6th, estimates of Allied numbers started to spread among senior officers. 100,000 men, then more, far more than German intelligence had ever thought possible in a single day. By evening, reports confirmed that the enemy had landed 150,000 soldiers ashore, complete with tanks, artillery, and supplies. General Jodl, chief of operations, was said to have stared in disbelief when he saw the numbers. The German army had prepared for a small attack. Instead, it faced a full-scale invasion of the continent. In Hitler's headquarters at Berghof in Bavaria, the dictator himself refused at first to send out armored reserves. Convinced this was a trick, he kept the panzer divisions in place, waiting for the real attack at Calais. Hours passed as Normandy filled with Allied troops. Field Marshal Rundstedt, commander-in-chief in the West, called repeatedly for permission to unleash the tanks, warning that delay would be deadly. Rommel, who had left his post to visit his wife in Germany, rushed back upon hearing the news, horrified that the invasion he had long feared was happening exactly where defenses were weakest. In the streets of Berlin, civilians listened to careful announcements on the radio. Propaganda broadcasts admitted that a British-American landing had happened, but insisted that it was being contained. But in private, many Germans feared the worst. They remembered what had happened to Italy after Allied troops landed there. In a few months, Mussolini's government had collapsed. If the same thing happened in France, the road to Germany would be open. The shock was not just among the public. Within the officer ranks, disbelief turned to panic as they studied the supplies behind the invasion. How had the Allies moved so many ships across the Channel without being seen? How had they landed entire divisions in a single day despite mines, obstacles, and defenses? The numbers made a mockery of all German ideas about modern warfare. Reports described endless lines of vehicles unloading onto beaches, ready-made harbors taking shape, and swarms of planes preventing the German Air Force from doing anything. By nightfall, German generals faced the unthinkable. Fortress Europe had been broken, not by trickery or luck, but by a force so large that it simply could not be stopped. The phrase whispered in command centers was always the same: "This is not possible." Yet it had happened. America, which many in Berlin had dismissed as a slow-moving industrial giant lacking military skill, had just shown a feat of organization and power that was much bigger than Germany's entire capacity. The war on the Western Front had started again, and this time it was a battle the Germans knew they could not win by tactics alone. When night fell on June 6th, the full impact of what had happened in Normandy started to sink in. The Atlantic Wall, advertised for years as impossible to break, lay shattered in many places. Along 50 miles of French coastline, Allied flags flew over beach areas held not by a few scattered groups of soldiers, but by an entire army from many countries firmly set up on European soil. German officers who had believed the initial landings could be pushed back into the sea were forced to accept a new reality. The enemy had done in one day what Germany had thought was impossible to do logistically. The numbers told the story. More than 150,000 Allied troops now occupied Normandy, supported by over 20,000 vehicles and hundreds of artillery pieces. Naval guns still threatened from offshore, ready to destroy any counterattack. Fighter planes made sure the German Air Force could not do much, while paratroopers controlled important crossroads far inland. In a matter of hours, the Allies had turned a stretch of rural French coastline into the base of a huge military operation. German reserves, even when they were used, would find themselves attacking strong positions instead of weak beach areas. The consequences were strategic and immediate. For Germany, France was the western shield that protected the heart of Germany. Its ports supplied submarine operations. Its fields and factories supported the German army, and its railways connected occupied Europe. Now, with Normandy in Allied hands, the shield was broken. In a few weeks, the Americans would pour in reinforcements at a rate the Germans could not match. Supply lines from Britain stretched across the Channel with ruthless efficiency, bringing fuel, food, ammunition, and replacements. Each day that passed meant the balance of power shifted further toward the Allies. What shocked Berlin most was the size of American logistical skill. The German army had always been proud of its operational skill, but it had never solved the problem of supporting large forces across long distances. In contrast, America showed on D-Day that it could move an army across an ocean, land it under fire, and supply it continuously. The industrial capacity behind the invasion seemed endless. For every tank destroyed on the beach, more arrived the next day. For every landing boat sunk, shipyards in the United States launched new ones to replace it. The Allies themselves recognized the day as a turning point. General Eisenhower's headquarters received reports of progress from each area, and by nightfall, he knew the beach areas were secure. Churchill in London told Parliament that the liberation of Europe had begun. For the people of France who were occupied, the sight of American soldiers handing out chocolate and cigarettes gave hope that 4 years of German rule were coming to an end. In German headquarters, however, the mood was bad. Senior officers admitted privately that Germany could no longer hold the West. Hitler still demanded counterattacks, but his orders went against reality. Fuel shortages ruined rail lines and the overwhelming power of Allied air power. The generals understood what the dictator would not. Normandy marked the irreversible start of Germany's defeat. The day ended with the beaches of France covered in wreckage, but they were firmly in Allied hands. A single day had changed the course of the war. The Germans had believed no army could land 150,000 men in such a short time. Now that impossible thing had become fact, and it meant the downfall of their empire.